The phone rang at 9:47 in the morning while I was elbow-deep in the engine bay of my '98 Chevy Silverado, trying to figure out why she was misfiring on cylinder number 3. I'd already pulled the spark plug, looked fine, and checked the wire connections. The compression gauge was sitting on my workbench next to a half-empty coffee cup that had gone cold an hour ago. I almost didn't answer the phone. My hands were covered in motor oil, and I had the valve cover half off. Nobody calls me that early except those damn telemarketers trying to sell me extended warranties on trucks that are older than some of their sales reps. But the phone kept ringing, and something about it felt urgent. I wiped my hands on an old shop rag that used to be blue, but was now the color of everything that had ever leaked out of an engine, and grabbed the cordless phone from the workbench. "Freeman? Mr. Charles Freeman?" The voice was professional, polite, but there was something tight underneath it, like someone trying to stay calm while delivering bad news. "Yeah, that's me. Who's this?" "This is Anthony Davis from First National Bank. Sir, I need you to come down here to our main branch immediately. There's a situation involving your accounts that requires your immediate attention. I'm Charles Freeman, 58 years old, retired construction supervisor. I spent 35 years building everything from strip malls to office complexes, and in that business, you learn to read people fast. Contractors, subcontractors, suppliers, they all have their tells when something's not right. This Anthony Davis had that same nervous energy I used to hear from subs who were about to tell me they'd screwed up something expensive." "What kind of situation?" I asked, leaning against my workbench. The Chevy's engine ticked as it cooled, and making those settling sounds that old trucks make. "Sir, your daughter-in-law Nancy is here with a man who claims to be your son Benjamin. But according to our records, didn't you tell us last week that Benjamin was traveling for business?" The wrench I'd been holding slipped out of my other hand and clanged against the concrete floor of my garage. That sound seemed to echo longer than it should have. "That's impossible," I said. "Benjamin called me yesterday evening from Chicago. Said the meetings were running long and he wouldn't be back until Friday." "Sir, I understand this is confusing, but I really need you to come down here right away. And Mr. Freeman, don't call anyone about this yet. Just come straight here." The line went dead. I stood there in my garage, surrounded by tools I'd been collecting for 40 years, looking at that phone like it had just told me the sky was green. Outside, I could hear my neighbor George Martinez running his leaf blower, and the same way he did every Tuesday morning like clockwork. I set the phone down and stared at my truck's engine. The distributor cap was sitting on the workbench, the rotor beside it. I'd been tracing an ignition problem that had been bugging me for weeks. Simple, logical problem with a simple, logical solution. But what Anthony Davis had just told me, that wasn't simple, and it sure as hell wasn't logical. Nancy was my daughter-in-law, married to my son Benjamin for 2 years now. Smart woman, worked in accounting at some firm downtown. After my wife Ellen died 3 years ago, Nancy had been helpful with paperwork, organizing things I didn't want to deal with. "Don't worry about it, Dad," she'd say. "I'll take care of the details." What details had she been taking care of? I wiped my hands again, this time more thoroughly, and walked over to the pegboard where I kept my keys. The garage smelled like motor oil, WD-40, and sawdust, smells that had been comforting to me for decades. Now they seemed like they belonged to someone else's life. My truck was blocked in by the parts I'd scattered around, so I grabbed the keys to my backup vehicle, a '92 Ford pickup that had seen better years but still ran solid. I'd bought it from a job site foreman who'd treated it right, and it had never let me down. George was in his front yard, wearing his usual Tuesday morning uniform, khaki pants and a polo shirt that his wife probably picked out for him. George was 60, retired from the Postal Service after 30 years of delivering mail through Michigan winters. We'd been neighbors for 15 years, and he had that same ability I'd developed over the years, spotting trouble before it announced itself. "Charles!" he called out, shutting off the leaf blower. "You look like someone just told you your house was on fire. Everything okay?" "Bank called," I said, walking toward the Ford. "Something's not right with Nancy and Benjamin." George's face changed. He set down the leaf blower and walked closer. "What kind of not right?" "The kind where the bank calls you to come down immediately and doesn't want you calling anyone first." George nodded slowly. In 30 years of postal work, he'd seen enough family drama to know when something was seriously wrong. "You want backup?" "Not yet," I said. "But stay by the phone." The drive to First National took me through downtown, past the construction sites where I'd spent most of my working life. There was a new office building going up on 5th Street that I'd bid on 2 years ago before I retired. Different contractor got it, probably by cutting corners I wouldn't cut. But seeing those steel beams going up, hearing the sounds of welders and diesel engines, it steadied me somehow. Banking wasn't my world. Tools and blueprints and concrete, and that was my world. Yes, but I'd been around long enough to know that when someone calls you with urgency in their voice and tells you not to call anyone, you're about to find out something you don't want to know. The parking lot at First National looked normal. Same brick building I'd been walking into for 25 years, same glass doors, same security cameras. But when I pushed through those doors, the security guard looked at me twice before I even said my name. "Charles Freeman," I told the receptionist. "Anthony Davis called me." She nodded immediately, like she'd been sitting there waiting for exactly those words. "Please follow me, Mr. Freeman." We walked down a hallway I'd never been down before, past offices with frosted glass doors, to a conference room at the end. Through the windows, I could see the main lobby where customers were conducting their normal business: deposits, withdrawals, loan applications, regular Tuesday morning banking. But I wasn't here for regular banking. Anthony Davis was waiting in the conference room, along with an older woman I didn't recognize. Davis looked like he was about 35, wearing a tie that was probably more expensive than the tools in my garage, but he had the nervous energy of a first-year apprentice who'd just discovered he'd been reading the blueprints upside down. The woman was different, maybe 50, with gray hair pulled back in a way that said she'd been handling serious problems for a long time. She stood up when I walked in, extended her hand with a firm grip that reminded me of the few female contractors I'd worked with over the years, women who'd earned their place in a tough business. "Mr. Freeman, I'm Susan Rodriguez from the bank's legal department," she said. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "What's this about?" I asked, taking the seat they offered, but not settling into it. When you've spent 35 years on construction sites, you learn to stay ready to move fast. Anthony Davis glanced at Susan Rodriguez, then pulled out a folder that looked thicker than it should have been for whatever simple banking issue I'd expected this to be. "Mr. Freeman," he began, "this morning at approximately 9:15, your daughter-in-law, Nancy Freeman, came in with a man claiming to be your son, Benjamin. They presented identification and requested to make significant changes to accounts that list you as the primary holder." "What kind of changes?" Susan leaned forward. "Adding Nancy as a joint primary account holder on your savings account, the one with your construction retirement funds. Also changing beneficiary designations and requesting access to your safety deposit box. My retirement savings. Money I'd put away dollar by dollar over 35 years, working overtime on weekends. Taking jobs in January when the cold made concrete work miserable, saving every bonus from completing projects ahead of schedule. Money that was supposed to keep me comfortable and eventually go to Benjamin when I was gone." "Where are they now?" I asked. Anthony pointed toward the frosted glass windows that looked out onto the main lobby. "Still here. We've been stalling, asking for additional documentation while we tried to reach you." "Show me," I said. Susan Rodriguez hesitated. Mr. Freeman, I have to advise you that if this is what we think it is, direct confrontation could compromise our ability to gather evidence and— Show me, I repeated. In construction, when someone tells you there's a problem with the foundation, you don't debate it in the trailer. You go look at the foundation. Anthony walked to the window and adjusted the blinds, creating a narrow gap that gave me a clear view of the lobby. And there she was. Nancy, sitting across from a bank manager's desk, wearing the navy blue dress she'd worn to last month's family barbecue. Her posture was perfect, her expression calm and confident. The same woman who'd helped me organize Ellen's medical bills after she died, who'd sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and talking about how hard it was to lose someone you love. And standing next to her was a man who looked exactly like my son. I'd been expecting some resemblance. That's what identity theft was about, right? Someone who looked enough like Benjamin to fool a bank teller who didn't know him well. But this was different. This man had Benjamin's height, his build, his way of standing with most of his weight on his left foot, because he'd broken his right ankle falling off a roof when he was 16. He had the same gesture Benjamin had developed as a teenager, touching his jaw with his fingertips when he was thinking about something. But I'd been watching Benjamin make that gesture for 20 years. I'd seen him do it when he was nervous about asking girls to high school dances, when he was deciding which college to attend, when he'd called to tell me he was going to propose to Nancy. This man was performing the gesture, not doing it naturally. How long have they been here? I asked. About 40 minutes, Anthony said. We started with standard verification questions, but some of the answers didn't match what we had on file. Susan Rodriguez opened her folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. They knew your full legal name, your social security number, your mother's maiden name. But when we asked about your son's middle name, they said James. Benjamin's middle name was Michael, after my father. I'd named him myself in the delivery room at St. Mary's Hospital 35 years ago, met with Ellen squeezing my hand so hard I thought she might break my fingers. What else did they get wrong? The imposter said you'd worked for Morrison Construction for most of your career, but our records show you worked for Great Lakes Construction. Morrison had been my first job out of high school, lasted about 6 months before I realized the foreman was an idiot and the company was cutting corners that were going to get someone killed. Great Lakes hired me in 1989, and I'd stayed until I started my own crew in 95, then worked as an independent contractor until I retired. Anyone who'd done their homework on me would know about Great Lakes, but you'd have to really know me to know about Morrison, and you'd have to know the construction business to understand why that detail mattered. They've been planning this, I said. That's what we think, Susan agreed. Professional operation. But they made mistakes that someone who actually knew you wouldn't make. I watched Nancy through the gap in the blinds. She was smiling at something the bank manager had said, laughing softly the way she did at family dinners. The same laugh she'd given when Benjamin had told the story about me falling through the subflooring on the Henderson job, landing in the basement covered in sawdust and insulation. But that story had happened 3 months after Benjamin and Nancy got married. She'd been there when he told it. She knew the details, knew the timing, knew why it was funny. I want to talk to them, I said. Mr. Freeman, Susan started. We really should— I'm not asking for advice, I interrupted. I'm 58 years old. I've been dealing with liars and cheats my entire working life, and those 2 people out there are trying to steal everything I've worked for. I want to talk to them. Anthony and Susan exchanged looks. It's the same look I used to get from city inspectors when I'd tell them exactly what I thought about their interpretation of the building codes. We'll be recording everything, Susan said finally, and security will be nearby. Fine. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and checked that my wallet was still in my back pocket. Force of habit from job sites, where things had a way of walking off if you weren't careful. Mr. Freeman, Anthony said as I headed toward the door. How do you want to handle this? I thought about that for a second. In construction, when you found someone trying to use substandard materials, you didn't dance around the issue. You called them out directly, in front of everyone, so there was no confusion about what was happening and who was responsible. I'm going to ask my son some questions that only my son would know the answers to, I said. And then we're going to see what happens when the wrong man gives me the wrong answers. I opened the conference room door and walked out into the lobby, but where my daughter-in-law and a stranger wearing my son's face were trying to steal my life. Nancy saw me first. For just a split second, her face went completely white, like someone had drained all the blood out of it. Then her training kicked in, and I realized that's exactly what it was, training. And she recovered with a smile that would have fooled anyone who hadn't spent 35 years reading people's faces when they were about to lie about why a job was behind schedule. "Dad," she said, standing up from the bank manager's desk, "what are you doing here? I thought you were working on the truck this morning." The man pretending to be my son turned around, and I got my first close look at him. The resemblance was unsettling. Whoever had done the surgical work was good, not just the face, but the way he carried himself, the way his shoulders sat. He'd studied Benjamin's posture, probably from photographs, maybe video. But photographs can't teach you 35 years of shared history. "Benjamin," I said, keeping my voice level the way I used to when I was about to fire someone, but wanted to give them one last chance to come clean. "How was the flight back from Chicago?" He smiled with what looked like genuine warmth. "Good actor." "It was fine, Dad. Glad to be home. Sorry I didn't call you. The meetings ended earlier than expected." "That's funny," I said, "because when I talked to you last night, you said the Peterson Industries contract was giving you problems, and you'd probably be there until Friday." I watched his eyes. In construction, when someone's lying about progress or materials or timeline, there's always a tell, a hesitation, a look away, something that gives them up. This guy was better than most, but he still had one. A tiny muscle twitch at the corner of his left eye. "Oh, right," he said. "Yeah, we got that sorted out faster than I thought." Nancy moved closer to him, and I could see her hand brush against his arm. A signal, maybe, or just nervousness. Either way, it told me they were working together, not just two separate cons that happened to collide. "That's great news about Peterson Industries," I said. "Benjamin's been worried about that job for months. What was the issue they finally resolved?" The muscle twitched again. Just some contract language. Nothing major." Benjamin had never mentioned Peterson Industries to me in his life. There was no Peterson Industries contract. I'd just made that up on the spot, the same way I used to test new subcontractors by asking them about imaginary building codes to see if they'd admit they didn't know something or try to bluff their way through. This guy was bluffing. But the bank manager, a middle-aged woman who'd probably seen her share of unusual situations, was watching our conversation with the focused attention of someone who realized she was witnessing something significant. I could sense Anthony Davis and Susan Rodriguez positioned somewhere behind me, probably recording every word. "Nancy," I said, turning to my daughter-in-law, "I'm curious about something. What was the name of Benjamin's first girlfriend? The one he brought to the house when he was 17? Nancy's smile flickered. "Dad, that's such a random question. Why would you—" "Just curious. Benjamin was telling me about her last month and I couldn't remember her name." The imposter jumped in. "Jennifer, wasn't it? Jennifer Martinez?" Wrong on both counts. Her name was Sarah, no last name I ever knew, and she'd lasted about 3 weeks before Benjamin decided he'd rather spend his time working on cars than sitting through romantic movies. But more importantly, Benjamin had never brought her to the house. I'd met her exactly once, at a high school football game, and she'd barely said hello. "No," I said simply. "That's not right either." That's when Nancy made her first real mistake. Instead of trying to play it off, instead of laughing and saying something about how she couldn't be expected to remember every girl Benjamin had dated in high school, she got defensive. "Look, Charles, we came here to take care of some financial business while Benjamin's schedule was free. I don't understand why you're giving us the third degree about ancient history." Charles. She'd called me Charles. Nancy had been calling me Dad for 2 years, ever since the wedding. Even during the worst parts of Ellen's illness, when everyone was stressed and saying things they didn't mean, Nancy had never called me anything but Dad. That one word told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to end. "Here's what I think is happening," I said, loud enough that the other customers in the lobby started paying attention. "Sometimes you need an audience to keep people honest. I think Nancy here has been planning this for a while. I think she's been copying my documents, learning my financial information, studying my family history. And I think she hired this man to pretend to be my son so they could walk in here and steal my retirement money." The imposter's face changed. The practiced confidence cracked, and underneath it I saw something between panic and resignation. He looked at Nancy with an expression that said this wasn't how it was supposed to go. "That's ridiculous," Nancy said, but her voice had gotten higher, tighter. "Charles, I think you need to sit down. You're not making sense." "Benjamin's middle name," I said. "What is it?" "James," the imposter said quickly. "Benjamin James Freeman." "Wrong." I felt something solid settle in my chest. It was the same feeling I used to get when I'd identified exactly what was wrong with a building's foundation and knew how to fix it. "His middle name is Michael, after my father. I was there when he was born, and I named him myself." The silence that followed was the kind you get on a job site right after someone's made a mistake that's going to cost everyone time and money, heavy, uncomfortable, full of the realization that something important has just gone very wrong. Nancy grabbed the imposter's arm. "We need to leave." But it was already too late for that. Bank security was already moving. I hadn't seen them position themselves, but they'd been watching from the moment I walked out of that conference room. 2 men in suits who moved with the kind of calm efficiency you see from people who've dealt with situations like this before. "Ma'am, sir, we're going to need you to remain here while we sort this out," one of them said to Nancy and the imposter. Nancy's mask finally came off completely. The helpful daughter-in-law, at the grieving woman who'd supported me through Ellen's illness, the caring family member who just wanted to make things easier, all of that disappeared. What was left was someone I'd never seen before, someone with cold eyes and a voice like broken glass. "This is harassment," she snapped at the security guard. "We haven't done anything wrong." But the imposter had already given up. He looked at Nancy with something between exhaustion and disgust. "It's over, Nancy. He knows." "Shut up, Philip," she hissed. Philip. So that was his real name. Not that it mattered much, but somehow knowing what to call him made the whole situation feel more concrete, more real. Susan Rodriguez appeared at my elbow with a cell phone. "Mr. Freeman, we've called the police. They'll want to speak with you, and we'll need you to verify some information for the investigation." The next 2 hours were a blur of paperwork, statements, and phone calls. The police officer who took my statement was a woman about Benjamin's age, who listened with the kind of focused attention that told me she'd seen financial fraud before and knew how devastating it could be for the victims. "They've been planning this for months," she told me, as we watched Nancy and Philip being led away in handcuffs. "Your daughter-in-law had copies of your documents, practice sheets with your signature, even medical records that would have given her access to your accounts if you became incapacitated." That hit me harder than the attempted theft itself. Nancy had been planning for my death or disability, positioning herself to take everything I'd worked for the moment I couldn't stop her. "Has she done this before?" I asked. "We're investigating. But Mr. Freeman, it's the man she hired, Philip Crawford. He's been arrested twice in other states for similar cons. This is what they do. I called Benjamin from the bank. It was 2:30 in the afternoon, Chicago time, and he answered on the second ring. "Dad? Everything okay? You never call me during the day." "Son, I need you to come home. There's been a situation with Nancy." The silence on the other end lasted so long, I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Benjamin said, "What kind of situation?" "The kind where your wife just tried to steal my retirement savings with the help of a man who had plastic surgery to look like you." Another long silence. Then, "I'll be on the next flight." Benjamin got home at 11:30 that night. I picked him up at the airport, and we drove in silence until we were almost at my house. Then he said, in a voice I hadn't heard since he was a little kid who'd broken something valuable, "Dad, I'm sorry." "What are you sorry for?" "I should have seen what she was doing. I should have known." I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. We sat there in the dark, with the dashboard lights casting shadows on our faces. Son, she fooled the bank employees. She fooled Philip into thinking this would work. She would have fooled a lot of people. But she made one mistake. What's that? She thought love was just information. Dates, names, facts you could memorize. She didn't understand that knowing someone means carrying 35 years of moments that can't be faked or studied. Benjamin moved back in with me for the next 6 weeks, while the legal proceedings worked their way through the system. We spent most evenings in the garage, working on that Chevy's misfiring problem. Turned out to be a hairline crack in the distributor cap that was only visible when you held it up to the light at exactly the right angle. "Kind of like people," Benjamin said when we found it. "And the flaws aren't always obvious until you know exactly what to look for." Nancy and Philip were both charged with identity theft, bank fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. Nancy got 5 years in federal prison. Philip got 3, partly because he cooperated with the investigation that uncovered 12 other victims across 4 states. The trial lasted 3 days. I testified about the verification questions, about how I knew Philip wasn't my son, about the documents Nancy had copied. When the prosecutor asked me how it felt to be betrayed by someone I'd trusted, I thought about it for a long moment. "It felt like finding out the foundation of a building you'd been living in was made of cardboard," I said. "Shocking, but once you know, you can fix it." These days, Benjamin calls me every night when he travels for work. Not because I ask him to, but because he wants to. We rebuilt trust the same way we rebuilt that Chevy engine. Carefully, methodically, one piece at a time. I still live in the same house, still work in the same garage, I still wave to George Martinez every morning when he gets his newspaper. But now, I read every document before I sign it. I ask questions when something doesn't make sense. I trust, but I verify. The phone still rings sometimes at odd hours. But now I answer it without hesitation because I know the difference between a problem I can solve and a disaster I can prevent. That morning when Anthony Davis called me about Nancy and Philip, he wasn't just warning me about a crime in progress. He was giving me a chance to protect what mattered most. Not just my money, but my family, my legacy, and the truth about who we really are. And that, it turns out, is worth more than any retirement account they could have stolen. The strongest locks in the world can't protect you from someone you hand the keys to, but the deepest love will always recognize a counterfeit. After 58 years on this earth, I've learned that protecting your family isn't just about what you leave behind. It's about making sure the right people are there to receive it.